Welcome to another presentation where we're looking at the evidence from research as we take education forward into the future. What does research actually tell us so that we can plan the future based on evidence? This is the 9th presentation in the series, and in this one we're going to look at this difficult area of assessment. What does research actually reveal about assessment? Now, this is not going to be a coverage of all aspects of assessment. It's focusing on where research has given us a clear steer and direction that can help us forward into the future. We all remember that. Perhaps we're still experiencing it. Raises the question, why do we have tests and exams at all? The students have to revise and revise. Is that education? And then the teachers have to mark. That's intellectual death. And for both the students and their teachers, there are tensions, pressures, disappointments. For what gain? For what value? Why do we put ourselves through this procedure? Is this a good way to reward success? And what about those who are not quite so successful? What is success? Is success to be defined in terms of we passed our examinations? Life is bigger than that. Fundamentally, does assessment actually support learning, or is it holding it back? For many, assessments and examinations are a certificate of failure that goes with them throughout life. We've got to look at this afresh. Now, there are two powerful pressures on school assessment today. You can imagine them as two pistons, both firing in and pressurizing assessment, caught in the middle. One is this. There's a great emphasis today, and it's been going on for decades, to reduce our dependence on memorization and recall, and to emphasize wider skills that are useful for life. But at the other end, there's international systems of assessment, and the rewards derive largely from recall skills. Now, the international organizations argue otherwise, but the research doesn't support their arguments. The students get their answers by recall, as research shows clearly. And this one's tending to win. And the wider skills of education are being lost because we're losing the information from research evidence. But we're back to the original question. What is assessment? We've got to tighten up and focus on the precise understanding of it. Here is one way of looking at it. It's a process of gathering accurate and reliable information on the knowledge, understandings and skills of learners. Now, there's a lot of key words in there. Accurate, reliable, you can get it repeated. Not just knowledge, not just recall, but understandings, probably the greatest and most central skill. But what about the skills? Skills that they will take on into life. Why do it? Well, at a deep level, and this is not a total picture, learners need to know how well they're doing. We need that kind of positive feedback. We're on the right lines. But we teachers know how well we are doing. Are we getting our message across? Are we developing genuine understanding? But it needn't be written exams. We've got so tightly bound into written exams, and the research papers all over the world show there are good alternative ways of carrying out assessment. All right, there's our description. Here's a more formal one. Designed to capture valid evidence, that means we're measuring what we think we're measuring, that students, upon completion of their programs, which might be a week, might be a month, might be a term, might be a year, might be longer, have adequately demonstrated the skills and capabilities expected of them. Nothing to do with recall there. And that's perhaps a deeper picture. We need to put these two together in a kind of a way because they do give us a picture of what assessment is all about. So we've got 3 questions. What is it? It gives us evidence about the extent of learning, but learning is essentially understanding, gaining skills useful in life. It informs the learners and it informs the teachers. And we should do it by as many ways that are acceptable in our societies. Not stick to written papers. But that's the key message. Assessment is designed for the benefit of learners. At the moment, throughout most of the world, we've lost that central focus. And when we lose it, assessment becomes a certificate of failure, and the evidence is very, very strong. By as many acceptable ways as possible. Are we measuring what we want to measure? What we think we are measuring. People make all kinds of claims. I've heard them internationally, I've heard them in examination board meetings. Where is the evidence? It is fascinating to actually sit and talk to students while they're undertaking an assessment or just afterwards. And we get insights into how they got their answers. They often are totally unrelated to the intentions of the examiners. Is it reliable? Did you just have a lucky day, a lucky paper, lucky experience? Is it acceptable? Is it acceptable that we put through students the tortures of endless written papers that last for long periods of time? It's very time intensive for both the learners and the teachers and anyone who's involved in setting and organising examinations. It's time demanding. Is it a useful use of time? Purposes for assessment. Now, this gives a lot of jargon here, but it simply is, it gives feedback to teachers and the students. But the thing is, in order to direct future learning. That's the purpose of it. The summative role, it gives information about the level of students' achievements at points during and at the end of school or university. These are two roles for assessment. They're distinct. But there's also a certification role. It provides the means for recognizing achievements and gaining entry to further study or to work. For certain jobs, you need a university degree in a given subject. That's a certification role. To get into a university, you will require certain passes at a certain level in certain subjects. And there are various jobs that require evidence of achievements. But there's also an evaluation role, where we can use evidence to evaluate the kind of things we're doing. Are we actually running the courses? We're doing them right? Have we got the right things in? That guides us for the future. Now, these are four very different roles, and they require four very different kinds of assessment, but these are purposes for assessment in a broad sense. But there's a broad principle that comes out of this. None of these assessments was ever designed to be able to compare teachers, to compare schools, or to compare nations. And when we use assessment results from schools, or indeed universities, but schools is the main problem worldwide, to compare teachers, to compare schools, or to compare nations, we're in very real danger. We're not comparing like with like. And the evidence is universal of the damage it does. A serious problem there that we've got in our societies today. Back to our four roles. That kind of assessment needs to be diagnostic, looking for where they've got it or not got it and why. It's got to be positive. The learners and the teachers work together. It's directed at the future, and it needs individualized feedback. That's very time intensive, and a lot of the books just ignore that rate determining step. Where do teachers find time to do that well? Very difficult to find the time. Now, both the summative and the certification role, it needs to sample from the whole curriculum area, sample from the range of desired skills understandings, and it's got to use multiple assessments. Don't rely on one examination. It's not reliable. The evidence is crystal clear. We'll look at that one again. This also needs to be diagnostic, but in a totally different sense. We're looking to see whether the kind of curriculum we've got and the way we're doing it is actually achieving the kind of things that we're wanted to get at. Or are we aiming in the wrong direction? So we've got to be very careful. You cannot use assessment that's designed for one task and interpret it for another. You'll get misleading outcomes. Now, our goals in assessment. Yes, we've got our awards and certification, and societies do demand these. We've also got directing future learning. So we've got our summative, and we've got our formative. And they're different kinds of assessment. The nature of them is different, the purpose is different, and the actual style of the questions is different, and the way we handle the output is totally different. We've got to be very clear about this. And assessment literacy means that as teachers we have the knowledge, understanding and skills to do this rigorously and robustly. And that is no easy task. Requires great skill, great creativity, great imagination and great human sensitivity. Not an easy task. And sometimes there are books that say that formative assessment's the way forward. We must all do it. They don't face up to the issue of the tremendous time demand to give individualized feedback. There are others who argue that exams, the marks are fixed, good, reliable, when the evidence shows they're not. We've got to have multiple assessments. We're back to another fundamental principle. The evidence shows clearly that if you design assessment for one purpose, never ever use it for another purpose. You've got to design assessment for the purpose you intend, because purposes are different. What kind of skills are we going to assess? Now, we could look at a human being and think, well, we've got the kind of intellectual things, we've got the kind of attitudinal things, and we've got the kind of practical things. A kind of artificial division, but it's kind of useful. And we go back to Bloom's analysis. Knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, evaluation from bottom to top. At school level, we tend to just sort of slide analysis, synthesis and evaluation under one heading and call it higher order skills. And we don't pay much attention to it because we don't know how to set questions that really test it in written papers. Now, what we have to remember is this. Bloom and his colleagues did brilliant work, but it was published in 1956. An awful lot of work has gone on since. And at the reference at the end, I'll show you a website which has brought some of that together. We're living in the past. We've got to build on Bloom and move forward. As more evidence has become available, we've got better pictures. We don't know how to measure the attitudes at an individual level with an acceptable level of accuracy. So don't try and do it. Some have tried it, it didn't work. You can measure the attitudes at a group level when you've got a statistical sample. We know how to do that, but not at an individual level. Now it's very important. The practical skills could be the practical skills of solving a second order differential equation in mathematics, right across to the practical skills of knowing how to bake a cake, manage a budget, fill up tax return forms. Very important. Equally valuable. Often neglected. But some of these skills are actually very demanding. And you cannot measure these things usually in a written paper. We've got to look at other ways to get at it. So let's focus on the intellectual side just for the moment, because that's where school emphasis has been, perhaps wrongly. Look at this. It's what we do with what we know. We can only understand what we know We can only apply what we know. We can only analyze what we know. We synthesize what we know. We evaluate what we know. It's not as simple as we thought. Here's a better way forward that comes out of that kind of a question. This has evolved over a period of time. I'm not suggesting it's the answer, but we've got to build on Bloom, his brilliant work. But it was set in one country against one particular problem that was a problem in his country at that time. It's a common problem. But here's another way of looking at it. This builds on the evidence a little bit better. Yes, we need to measure what students know, or can be accessed. One of the skills of today is knowing how to get information in the days of the internet. Here's a description of what we mean by understanding. The extent to which the student can apply their knowledge in novel situations with some prospect of success. Despite what Bloom said, we've built on Bloom. The evidence for understanding is being able to apply. That clarifies the Bloom taxonomy quite a lot and takes us forward. But what about all the doing things, skills? Could be practical, could be procedural, could be highly intellectual, could be very much hands-on. It could be social, interrelational. Schools have to deal with all of these things. Then what about thinking? We take our thinking skills into life. And I've put down creative, critical and scientific thinking because the analysis shows that these three are probably the central three at school level. Not suggesting they're all equally important, but they're in the school level. There are perhaps at least one more group of thinking, but it's not very relevant at school level. But we have to look at thinking more analytically. Today, surrounded by the internet, with information flying at us, not all of which is right, some of which is deliberately wrong and misleading. Here's a description of what evaluation really means. Asking the questions why, what and how of new information, its sources, and the way it links to what is already known and understood. There are research studies on that. Our young people need to be able to communicate their understandings, both verbally and written. And some will find one much harder than the other. But can they do it coherently and logically? And can they relate what they've been studying to the major practical issues of modern living? School education is to prepare people for life, the society into which they are moving. Where do we measure that in our assessment? Now, there are 7 goals which tend to capture things much better today. Remember that. Yet another fundamental principle. We're not seeking to put youngsters out from our school system into the world with their heads stuffed full of information that they've memorized and can recall accurately and quickly. We are seeking to educate future citizens, to equip them to live in societies which are increasingly complex. Assessment must reflect that, and all these written examinations and national testing and international testing undermine it. We have a vexed issue which is often connected to assessment of educational standards. And this area is just full of wrong ideas. Much of it's because we've never described or defined what we mean by standards, and it's very difficult to do. So let's look again at the evidence relating to standards. That's the first piece of evidence that might shake us. Written examinations, simply by their nature, can only measure a very narrow range of skills. Other skills can't be measured that way. Very important other skills. Written examinations are taken on one day, in one context, in one circumstance, and they are simply not reliable enough as one-offs. And there are far too many things that influence the output from examinations over which schools and universities have no control. There is no connection between standards and the results of written examinations. That's been known for a long time. All examinations do is merely place candidates in an approximate order on the basis of one paper taken on one day. Did the paper suit the candidates? Did it suit a particular school and style of teaching? Did the candidate, an individual candidate, have a good day, a bad day? You don't know. But they don't measure in the absolute sense. A mark means nothing. It just puts people in an approximate order. It's not even accurate if it's just one paper. There's an argument that says only written papers set by an external examination board give a good measure of performance. You can't rely on teacher assessments. Research shows that's not true. Teachers are extremely good at assessing their students, and they often use far more diverse ways than just written papers. Teachers are close to the students. They understand and know the students. They can see the good points and bad points. We've got to couple the two together. One exam, end of course examination in a subject as a measure is utterly unreliable. You need several assessments on several occasions and bring them together in some way. The evidence shows very clearly that's much more reliable, and the much is very, very much more reliable and accurate. We've got to think that through. And that's one of the reasons why combining an external exam with teacher assessments is so powerful. Straight away, the teacher assessments are often relying on several assessments by several means. The external examination is one measurement. Bring them together in some way. You're getting a more reliable and accurate picture. But there are some areas of the world that don't have national exams, and they seem to manage it entirely on teacher assessments, and the universities there are delighted with the output. Another fundamental principle. I got 51%, you're delighted. I got 49%, you're sad. It's just garbage. Paper could be easy, could be difficult. You could have had a good day, a bad day. Questions could have suited you, not suited you. It could go on. Marks mean absolutely nothing. They merely put students in some sort of rough and approximate order. What's the way ahead? We've done a kind of demolition job. Now let's look at positive ways forward. How about using that for assessment? They tell us what they can do. Yes, we have written papers. They write down what they understand, not recall. Observations. They show us what they can do. Task completion. They undertake tasks of known value. If you look at universities, you will find that in many, many departments, they have moved assessment forward. And the former European transfer network, that brought assessment and unified it across the European universities, has got some brilliant insights, some broad principles. And many university departments have embraced these and taken them forward. It's enriched teaching, it's enriched learning. Schools were still stuck in the dark ages because we're controlled by national testing and international testing. Let's learn from the research evidence, where the European Credit Transfer Network based its proposals and structures on research evidence. We've got objective testing. That implies there has to be subjective testing. And we think that sounds good. Takes out the human element where we all make mistakes. But wait a minute, it's not as simple as that. The only thing about objective testing that's objective is the marking. Can I mark my machines or a computer? The curriculum goals are still designed by humans. The questions are set by humans. The paper is designed by humans and put together. The scores are interpreted by humans. Objective testing is nowhere near as objective as we think it is. It is not a solution. It's not a magic answer. It just takes the drudgery out of marking. Let's talk about human marking for the moment. We're familiar with short and extended answers in our papers. Practical tests, where students do something. Observations, where we watch them do something. Yes, there's the essays and dissertations, which they may work up in their own time, not under exam conditions. Projects, which can be both practical and intellectual. Oral presentations, where they can tell us what they've understood. And I'll come back to duly performed tasks later, where they complete something which is of known value. That's where the human involved in marking. Now let's look at where the machines can mark it. A computer or a machine designed to do it. We're familiar with multiple choice, but there's a better way of doing it. The most powerful technique I've ever come across for measuring conceptual understanding. Won't apply in every subject area, but it applies in many. Short answer questions and essays. And you see, how can computers mark them? Yes, there are good and reliable computer programs that have been developed that will mark both. And there is no ideal method. We've got to use the right method for the right task, for the right goals, and the right purposes, in the right context. That's a human judgment. But let's use as many of these as we think are appropriate in a particular course. Now, what's known from research about multiple choice, it tends to measure recall recognition, and despite claims otherwise, the evidence shows that is true, and it is very difficult to set good questions. Very roughly, for every 6 questions that are set, only 1 will survive through to being looked at seriously. That's an awful lot of work for very little output to get good questions, acceptable by quality examination boards. But the tragic thing is, they're found to be highly unreliable in numerous ways. Way they're structured, where they're placed in a test, and even from one day to the next. They don't give consistent results. Why use them? That's a better way. It's still got the limitation of recall recognition. It's still difficult to set the good questions, but the reliability improves straight away. Part of that is it can measure partial knowledge. And you can adapt your multiple choice questions into that format straight away. This was first published in 1972. It's not modern. It's been brought in some systems, and it's used in universities in some subject areas. Its great power is measuring conceptual understanding. It does it really well. It's easier, not easy, but it's easier. It can be time efficient and demanding. Time efficient, that you can get a lot of questions out of one grid. I'll show you in a moment what that means. But the students find it mentally taxing. And it gets around the problems of working memory load just for the way it's structured. And the modern computing now, what has been shown is the accuracy as good as human markers. But that does require quite a lot of investment into computing technology to do it. But open universities have looked at that area and given us a lead there. Let's look at the partial knowledge one, which may not be familiar to you. It looks like a multiple choice question. Well, let's assume for the moment there are 4 so-called answers distractors offered, but the student, instead of just ticking or ringing the right one, is instructed to do the following. Tick the answer you think's right, put a cross against 2 answers that you're certain are wrong, and you leave a blank against the other one. Now what actually you're doing is, instead of right, wrong, you're saying right, wrong, I'm not sure. That's why it's called partial knowledge. This has been tested to destruction in the research literature. Now, here's a fictitious example. Suppose there are A, B, C, D, your 4 answers offered, distractors. Suppose B is the correct one. Student 1 does this. Ticks the right answer, obviously puts a cross against 2 wrong ones. They've got it right. Student 2 ticks the wrong answer, but also crosses wrong answers. So the right answer, they're not sure about. They've got partial knowledge, you might give them half a mark. Student 3 ticks the wrong answer, but crosses the right answer. They haven't a clue. No marks. And a computer can handle that easily. And straight away the question style is improved. You've got to train the youngsters to be used to this, but it comes very quickly. Let's look at structured communication grids that are so powerful. I'm going to put up one. It's fairly trivial, but I put it up simply because it's quick and easy to get your head round and read. Don't worry about the chemistry here. I just picked it out of the literature as an example. They're all over the literature. You'll find examples. There are 9 elements shown in 9 boxes labelled A up to I. Boxes are just used for convenience, but you can ask a whole lot of questions. And the instructions are: select all the boxes which contain elements which. It's not just one box, and they don't know how many. They can't guess. Which are metals? So they write down all the letters of the ones that are metals. Which are gases at room temperature? Which are present in limestone? Do they understand anything about limestone? Which form dioxys? An understanding of the concept of valency. Which are present in the human body in large amounts? A bit into the biochemistry. Now, I put this one up. It has been used and it works well, and a computer can mark it. Now I want to put up one which gives the same kind of structure, again taken from the literature. Oh, there's another answer there. Which are present in ammonium nitrate fertilizers. Now this was fitting a section which looked at where elements were used in society. So it had a context which was relevant. Now here's one that's mind-bending. From the realm of physics. 9 circuits are put up in boxes labelled 1 to 9. This was used in Taiwan, I think, with about aged 13, maybe 14. They handle it fine. So you get a grid like that. The instructions are, in the grid alongside there are 9 complete circuits. In each circuit the voltage of the batteries is the same. The bulbs are identical and the wires are resistance free. Now don't worry about the physics. That's just clarifying the limitations on the diagrams. The diagrams are designed in ways that are familiar from their course, and the instructions will mean a lot to the students answering the questions. Now let's just squeeze this down a little bit so I can put the questions up on screen. Select the box or boxes. They don't know whether it's one box or all 9. And it clarifies it. This is all translated from Mandarin Chinese. Boxes may be used as many times as you wish. Use the box numbers in your answers. Where the bulbs have the same brightness as the bulb in box 1. So they're comparing each diagram to the diagram in box 1. Where the bulbs receive the smallest voltage. Where the ammeter shows the largest value. This test, do they really understand circuits? Do they really understand direct current electricity? Powerfully diagnostic. Gave valuable information. This was used in a research exercise. And it gave massive amounts of useful information. Structured communication grids. What's been found about them? Now, 9 boxes were shown there, and the number of boxes depends on age. If you've got very young children, they've been used with these 6 boxes. Most school time 9, maybe at the end of school into university 16, but that's about your limit. computer markable, and it's a standard scoring system. Don't worry about this. There's a reference at the end which will give you this, but that's why you code into the computer. Any spreadsheet will do it instantly, quite apart from a computer. Very powerful. That comes straight from the original paper, 1972. What it does is this. It separates very clearly those students who really understand the topic from those who do not. It's highly discriminating. That's what you want in an examination. You can use it diagnostically in formative assessment as well. Guessing is virtually eliminated. They don't have any answers to any question. You can use anything in the boxes. One had names, one had diagrams, but you can put anything and you can mix them up. Computers can show patterns of choices which can give you a lot of information which helps us to understand what's going on. Very powerful, but let's look at written papers that are familiar to us. We've got our short answer papers, extended answer papers. We've got our essays, structured questions. Let's just look at that one for a moment. Short answer questions, maybe up to 5 marks, maybe about 10 marks, maybe about 20 marks, maybe about 10 marks, just rough ideas. A question could be in 3 parts. This is not rigid, but some examination boards do use this as a kind of guideline, a rubric. The first bit, for just maybe 2 marks, is a very straightforward question. Almost everybody can get it right. It sets their mind working, gives them confidence to move forward. Good psychology. The next bit is the central understanding they're trying to get at. Maybe you give 5 marks for it. And then the deeper insights for separating out the really able students who understands things at a deeper level, 3 marks. Wonderful way to structure questions, and it is so simple. The evidence shows it works. Marking essays. This was the old way of doing it. You went through and gave a tick for everything that was a correct fact, totted it up, and that gave you your total. That's just recall. This is a better way. This is based on real work, real evidence. In a way like this. It's not rigid. You can adapt this. You're looking for evidence from the essay that the candidate has achieved certain things. We're looking at skills, achievements, not just recall. Okay, is what they're saying right? Have they understood what they're saying? You're looking for evidence. Have they demonstrated critical thinking? And we have to define that. To find further back there, the references will give you that in more detail. Have they justified the points being made? They're following an argument. And can you write in a clear, logical and correct manner? Just for convenience, 4 marks was given to each, but you could decide information was less important. The last one was more important. That's a value judgment. But there's a great way to use essays, widely used, and that kind of approach is used extensively at university level. But I've seen it used at senior school level as well. What about oral skills? Not just writing skills. Most of life we don't write, we speak to each other, we communicate orally. Suppose we ask every student to prepare and deliver a very short presentation. It's part of a course assessment, so you take it seriously. But you give the student a different aspect related to the topic. You're allowed, say, 5 minutes. Now, that may be too short. You may want to make it 7 minutes, 10 minutes, but keep it short at the beginning. I've seen this done with 15-year-olds. Brilliant. Works really well. The actual preparation and organisation of the material they're going to present, and they can be allowed a computer or whatever to help them, that teaches them useful skills. But they're all teaching each other. So you're not wasting the time, because if you think about them all giving a presentation for 5 minutes, then you maybe take 2 or 3 lessons to get through a class. But they've all learned massively from each other, and they've gained confidence in communicating ideas. You're getting an assessment of their ability, and you can mark it in the same kind of a way. How do we assess skills, not knowledge, not recall? Oral skills. So suppose they're doing their presentation, measuring their oral skills. You could give 2 marks out of 2 for a good introduction. And there's the way of marking it. Did they gain audience interest right from the start? Did they bring it to a memorable conclusion? Was the content they chose relevant to what they were trying to cover? How well did they communicate? Nowadays we use visuals all the time. And that is part of the learning the world of communication. So intensely important because of the advent of the internet. And then a mark for lucidity, logical clarity. Did they hold the attention of the audience? You see, you're not marking for content, you're not marking for recall, you're marking for skills. And these skills are so important going out into life. How many jobs and surveys done of employers show that the employers want these kind of skills? Being able to communicate clearly, logically, tersely. And you can mark it to reward these. Far more valuable than a written examination paper, and it can be time efficient. Let's look at it a bit further. You see, many skills you can't assess with reliability. Observation, oral presentation, written examination, doesn't matter which one you use, you're not going to get at these skills. They're far more subtle. How are we going to get at skills and assess skills that are not accessible? There's a way of doing it. And it relies on a principle. You see, in our assessment, we look at the product at the end of a course, a unit of work, a year, or whatever. We look at the product. What have they got overall? Why not look at the process through which they're going? That gives us massive evidence about development and the gaining of skills. So a student has completed a task in a satisfactory way. They gain the credit for completing the learning process. So, for example, there might be a web search to bring in information and gather ideas and present them in some way. Now, you can't mark it accurately because you don't know the skills that are technical in the computer handling. They don't even know whether they're going to get help at home, whether they've got a computer at home that will make it more possible, whether they've got a relative who can help them along the way. But supposing they've done it, gone through it, the very process of going through it has taken them forward and educated them. Give them the credit. So you ask the student to complete the task. You gain the evidence that they've done that. And you reward the credit for task completion. Again, in the references given, there are numerous examples of this. They have been used. It's been used for decades. I first came across it in the 1960s because a great way to measure lab work was to measure the completion of the experiment satisfactorily, not giving marks for so-called right answers. That destroys the nature of science. That was done. Works well. And it gives the task value in the eyes of the learner. I'm going to put my back into this because I'm going to get a few marks. It's going to add to my year total mark. And it gets round giving credit for the wrong skills. Mark your lab reports at the end. You're not measuring the right skills. That's been clearly shown. You look at the process, not the product. Because the process gives you value. The product can be influenced by loads of other factors which are not relevant. Great way to move forward. And that's what's called duly performed assessment. You'll find that expanded in the references at the end. Interesting concept. If you've created a question or an examination paper or a set of tasks or whatever, nobody's perfect. Looks good to you. Get with 2 colleagues. 2 colleagues you can trust and who can tell you the truth. Work with them affirmatively. I've seen this done where people have developed 2 questions each and they're going to look at how to put together an examination paper. They sit down together an hour, look at every single question together. 3 people working together is about the right group dynamics to make this work. And for every single question or part of a question, you say, what is the item or question testing? Is it just simply recall? How are they going to get an answer to this? Recall? You're trying to get that down. Is it worth testing? Oh, the number of papers I've seen where they test things because we can test them easily, but they're not worth testing. They're not important. We've distorted the nature of understanding. And are there any obvious faults, anything that can mislead them? Now, just simply asking these 3 simple questions of every single question or item, that removes a lot of the problems. And if you can do it as a team, that makes it better. You're not criticizing each other, you're criticizing the questions. And you can have a lot of laughter and fun over that. I've worked in many groups that have done that. We've learned so much from each other because you get higher quality. And you've got the deep satisfaction. You've produced something good. Simple, practical, straightforward. It's been quite a race through. I hope you're still with me. Let's try and bring it together into some sort of principles that can help us. I'm putting these up as 8 clear messages. We need to be very clear what we're trying to assess. In this presentation, 7 goals have been drawn from the literature and are presented. Now, you may not want these 7 goals, but you've got to have your clear goals. But the 7 are offered because they're based on a lot of evidence. Assess across multiple areas. Don't just stick to one area. Recall. That's not important in life. Use as many approaches as you can. Different approaches have different strengths and weaknesses. Take advantage of it. And don't have a single one-off examination. Or even history today with a paper in the morning and a paper in the afternoon. That's not enough. Use multiple assessments on different occasions by different methods. And trust the teachers. The evidence shows that teachers are brilliant at putting their students in an approximate order of merit, and they do it accurately. They get it right. I'm not saying remove multiple choice, but let's get it down a long way. The evidence shows multiple flaws in multiple choice. Now, when we mark essays, projects, dissertations, I've suggested a way. In the literature, there are numerous ways there. Use your creativity, but decide what you want to measure, and then use it for that benefit. And never ever use assessment data to compare teachers, schools or countries. It's a completely flawed agenda, and it's doing immense damage to education. And the literature showing that is enormous, consistent, all over the world. We're holding education back by that policy. It's flawed at every level. There's 8 clear messages. Let's look at them just a fraction more. Remember, that's what assessment's trying to do. Valid evidence demonstrated the skills and capabilities, not memorized knowledge. There's the 7 goals I've suggested here. Work that through. If you come up with a better group, great. But that's based on a lot of evidence. Remember, there are 4 general approaches. Listen, read, observe, and then have a look at the process of learning, not the product. All are important. All can be used at school level. All have been used at school level, highly successfully. Remember that. The expertise in a teacher with a little experience is simply phenomenal. They know their students better than anybody else. What they need help with is to see their students in the wider context of what's happening nationally, which is why a written paper can be helpful, although there are ways around that. Never use a one-off examination. Use multiple but shorter assessments. So you can perfectly well have an examination board in a country saying 50% of the marks come from teacher assessments, and we need evidence that the teachers have done them and done them in the required way, and only 50% comes from an end of course examination. There's one way of looking at it. Essays, projects, dissertations can give you evidence of important skills if you look for them and you mark for them, and you tell the students that's what you're going to do at the outset. You can minimize the use of multiple choice. Perhaps you can replace some of them by personal knowledge. Structured communication grids I don't think will work in every discipline. I've seen no examples in some disciplines, but they certainly work in the sciences and in the social subjects. I'm not convinced they would work in language or mathematics. But I'm not, just because I've never seen them. And that fundamental principle destroys it all, undermines all the good, because it contradicts that fundamental principle. If you design assessment for one purpose, let's say to diagnose weaknesses so that you can guide you in your future learning, don't use the marks for anything else at all. You'll get a wrong conclusion. Now, there's a reference list here, and again it's limited, but it's squashed on the page. Paper online at the top, set in one country, but it's typical. There are many books that give you overall pictures, but notice the website of Steve Draper, the third one down. This looks at Bloom ideas and developing from them. You can look at how it works out, for example, the International Baccalaureate Organization, just below halfway down, IB Assessment Practices. Just below that, Johnson, who is an eminent authority in assessment, has got a practical guide and objective assessment there. Yes, it's old, written with a university mindset, but very useful, and you can download it free. He's got papers there which have looked at fixed response questions like multiple choice and structured communication grids. So there are practical sources of information, and again, as before, putting up two books because you can get a lot of references from them. The one on the left, chapters 8 and 9, deal with assessment and have scores of references to all the teams and topics. And the one on the right, which you could get by contacting the board, that again translates it into the practicalities of an examination board national assessment system, but again it's got a lot of the references because it's been based on research evidence. It's not just a practical guide. So if you want to follow something up, there are sources that allow you to follow things through a bit further. Assessment's been hard going. If anything, maybe you feel the boulder is running down the hill and it's about to flatten you. The final presentation in this series of 10, we're going to look at a range of beliefs and practices that are taking place in education today that are not supported by the evidence from research. I've called them educational delusions. Frightening thought. We need to get evidence backed into the centre of our educational planning, and that's going to move us forward one step further.